Welcome to the Let's Clear the Air Energy Podcast. Conversations focused on how some of the world's top energy leaders are innovating to deliver clean, affordable, and reliable energy for the future.
Welcome to episode 30 of the Let's Clear the Air Energy Podcast. I'm Kevin Broom, filling in for Adam Murray, who's out today, but we're joined today by our usual compliments, Stuart Saulters, Bryan Nix. And today we have our guest, is journalist, podcaster, and author Matt Yglesias. He is a self-described normie liberal who writes extensively about economics and public policy. He's also a podcaster and does appearances all over, that kind of thing. Matt founded the Slow Boring newsletter on Substack. He was a co-founder of Vox alongside Ezra Klein and Melissa Bell, where he covered politics and economic policy and co-hosted the Weeds podcast with Ezra Klein. Matt is a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, author of several books, including The Rent is Too Damn High, Heads in the Sand, and the national bestseller, 1 Billion Americans. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Really glad to be here. How you doing?
Good. We are glad to have you. We try with this podcast. We are Midstream. Mm-hmm. We represent the Midstream, and we like to bring in people from outside the Midstream to include, give us expand our thinking, give us some things to think about, and we're hoping that we can get into some things that will challenge what we think. So, thought we usually do an icebreaker. Adam is usually the one who comes up with them, but today we thought we'd play a quick round of popular and wrong. And so, let's start with that. So, Matt, what's a policy idea or political belief currently popular within your general political group that you think is mistaken or counterproductive?
Well, I don't think this will be controversial to your audience, but, most of the Democrats who I know, people who I socialize with, talk to, et cetera, are very certain that blocking the construction of natural gas infrastructure is going to have large environmental benefits. And I don't think that that's nearly as true as they think that it is. And it may be backwards in many, many cases. And at a minimum, they are not doing the work to actually look through these things or even assess what they're talking about. They have convinced themselves that it's so obviously the case that any kind of pipeline or other infrastructure is bad for global environmental concerns, that they don't need to even do the evaluation. And I think that that's seriously mistaken, and it's leading to a lot of bad calls in individual cases.
Yeah. Stuart, Bryan, either one of you guys want to join in, play this one?
Well, that's let's see. I'll try something.
I'll nominate Stuart because he's our vice president of federal affairs. So,
right. No, I'll follow the policy line of thinking here. Matt, I guess I don't know if this is the right way to phrase this or the right popular wrong way to ask this question, but I'm just curious, the kind of your side, if you want to call it that. Mm-hmm. What is the thought on subsidies for all forms of energy?
Mm-hmm. Well, what is a subsidy is a very contentious question. And then I feel like people don't always totally interrogate, what do they mean by subsidy? It's something that really blew my mind at one point is I'd read a lot. I didn't really cover climate and energy issues when I was at Vox. I covered sort of economic policy, which was considered a different silo. But I'd read different articles that were talking about, trillions of dollars in fossil fuel subsidies around the world. I read these headlines. I don't know. That seems bad. That seems like a big waste of money. We probably shouldn't do that. And when I poked into the details of what those studies were characterizing as subsidy, it was interesting. Basically they were saying that the existence of unpriced pollution externalities is a subsidy. I can see the case for that. I'm not I have no idea what you're talking about, but that's not a normal person's understanding of what subsidy means. Then you have, both for fossil fuels and for renewables, lots of sort of tax benefits. And if you know the tax code, the fact is that very few industries are operating with zero subsidy in that sense, and it's a little hard to know like what the like no subsidy baseline hypothetical is. You see this a lot in real estate development, where if a big project comes in, a city will often give them a break on paying property taxes for the first 10 whatever years of it. And you'll see in an article, they have like a $17 trillion subsidy for this. And you have to actually look like what is the cash expenditure versus what's like a tax deferral package. I mean, it all makes a difference or not. But and just to say, like, this whole question of subsidy it's a lot more complicated than it sounds. And I think very few people, like myself included, fully have our arms around it.
So let's dive in. One of the reasons we invited you, and is actually very much along the lines of what you mentioned in the popular and wrong portion, where you wrote an article in your Substack on October 30th, and the headline was "Climate Policies Should Reduce Greenhouse Gas Emissions," which is kind of a mind-blowingly obvious statement. And but still, let's dig into it. And in it, you point out a flaw that opponents of pipeline projects, and you're specifically talking about Democratic lawmakers citing climate concerns regarding the Northeast Supply Enhancement Project, but they didn't provide any actual emissions impact. Not an estimate, not a guess, nothing. They just said they were concerned. So why do you think that these kinds of basic quantitative questions is so consistently ignored in this kind of a debate? And is that a failure of analysis, or is the answer just politically inconvenient, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, the question is sort of inconvenient for what, right? I mean, I remember going all the way back to the Keystone debates in the Obama administration. And, at the time, a lot of people were looking at that and were saying, I don't get what the big deal is here exactly. Why is there so much focus on this question? And I think if you probed people in the environmental movement as to what they were doing at that time, was, they had hit upon a project that had a special regulatory status because it was crossing international boundaries. Because of that regulatory status, you could make a decision on sort of vague national interest grounds rather than needing to go through the cost-benefit analysis process. There's a million ways you could do cost-benefit analysis if you wanted, but the Obama administration's cost-benefit analysis people didn't have the answers that environmentalists wanted on a lot of questions. So they were eager to find a thing that would sort of loophole through that process. But so you would ask Bill McKibben, still, who cares? What are you doing here? And they had this whole theory about sort of movement building, that you needed to be picking a concrete fight, that they wanted basically they were tired of hearing the answer from Obama. If you want me to do more on climate, you have to help me win a majority in Congress, right? They didn't like that answer from him. They wanted something that Obama could do for them so that they could do organizing and say, hey, Mr. President, you've got to do this thing. So they hit upon this sort of particular thing, which it was true. The Obama administration had the authority to kill that pipeline. But this inculcated a habit of this kind of organizing chum, I call it, where you're throwing stuff out because it's an object for organizing, rather than focusing on, what's our actual priority here, right? Which is difficult. I mean, it is just objectively challenging to get people in the United States of America to make short-term economic sacrifices in order to address a long-term global problem. And if I name anything that has that structure, right, say I want you to pay higher taxes so that we can give malaria medication to people in Nigeria 5 years in the future. Everyone's going to understand why that's hard, right? It's not necessarily a crazy idea, but, it's a tough sell to voters. So, climate is a challenging problem, logistically. And there used to be hope of a binding international treaty, and that all fell apart because diplomacy is hard, right? All these things are hard. And so you came to have a lot of focus on this sort of project by project trench warfare, which I think is ultimately motivated by people who care a lot about the climate issue, not wanting to admit to themselves what the actual problem is. So they like to pick these sort of small bore fights rather than like owning up to the scale and objective challenge of the problem.
So just a quick follow-up, because it was something that you said sparked this thought, and that is, why is it, or why do you think it is that climate advocates, policymakers, et cetera, don't focus on some of the real world successes? So in the US, GDP has gone up, energy production has gone up, real emissions have gone down. And a big reason for that is that we've been using natural gas to generate electricity. And so why isn't that being something that's talked about a little bit more and understood as, okay, we're going to accept some natural gas infrastructure in the name of lowering emissions?
Right. I mean, this is my point of view, which is, going to be friendly to you guys, but it's like we should try to make our emissions go down to the extent that we can do that in an economically constructive way. And that means building renewable energy. It means promoting electrification of home appliances, things where that technology is feasible. And it means continuing to add natural gas to the electricity grid, because electrification per se is environmentally sound, because gas is a lot cleaner than coal, which continues to be used around the world, and because gas and renewables have good complementary properties. And so you are in a trajectory where, GDP goes up, emissions goes down. That's pretty good, right? Like if around the world we could get people to keep generating more electricity but burn less coal, that's a win-win. And it is possible with a mix of gas and renewables, long-term electrification, et cetera. And then you have to there's challenging technical problems, right? Like you cannot currently make an airplane go with electricity. You need jet fuel. You need oil to manufacture that. And like, I would like to solve that problem, but like I cannot personally. Somebody has to do it. But, the climate movement has been organized for 15 to 20 years now around these targets and timelines. And what's true is that if you pursue the kind of pragmatic course that I am suggesting, you are not going to hit those targets and those timelines. You will have more than 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. The good news is, you won't have 7 degrees, right? You won't have like endless escalation, because we are making progress on the problem. And so to me, that's about as good as you can do on any complicated problem in the world. Is you're making steady progress over time, like that's pretty good. But the movement is oriented around this, I would say, overly ambitious, unrealistic goal for itself, and it leads to bad judgment about specifics. And I also think that, we've developed real bad blood between industry and people in the political sphere, which I think has made it challenging for elected officials who, I love elected officials. There's some great people out there. Most people get into politics because there's like 1 or 2 things that they really care a lot about. And on all the other issues, they're just kind of taking positions that have been handed to them by their peers, by their colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. So you come in, you're a Democrat, you're for doing something on climate change, which you like heard around the way is that like, this is our climate policy. And you do it without that much scrutiny. And the handful of members, from Colorado, other places that have oil and gas industry, are better informed about these topics. But there's not that many of them now. And I think, work needs to be done to educate people about, just like what's actually going on here and what the real trade-offs are.
Yeah, Matt, you kind of spoke on this. A follow up here. So we're all in the oil and gas industry. A lot of our listeners, number 2, is there, and feel free, open forum. Is there something in our industry that we're doing counterproductive to kind of stoke that, us versus them animosity thing going on?
Well, I think it's just would be wrong to assume that everyone who's taking positions that you don't like is coming to that position from a place of like hardcore ideological conviction, right? I mean, we were talking about Northeast Supply. Governor Hochul has come around to, I think, what's clearly the right position on that. New York is not an oil and gas state, right? Does not have an oil and gas industry, does not have a legacy of like fossil fuel knowledgeable Democrats. But she is the governor, so she is ultimately responsible for outcomes in the state. She has to weigh these things fairly heavily, is coming around to the right choice on it, is facing criticism, but is now also drawing out some people who are supporting her, and who are on her side. And I think a question for the industry is, can you guys get to a point where you are supportive and rewarding Democrats who take political risks to do the right thing here, knowing that, look, most business people in any industry, all things considered, just prefer Republicans to win elections. It's like a lower tax party and all other things. So it's always going to be the case, I think, that a lot of people in the oil and gas industry are going to prefer Republicans no matter what Democrats come on and do. But to separate sort of what's our macro partisan take from, are Democrats saying things that are untrue about this, or which ones are doing what Governor Hochul is doing and coming to like a correct assessment on this, where she just, from the facts of like, what is this pipeline about? What is the electricity situation in the Northeast? Like, what are we dealing with? Like, she is doing the right thing. Governor Healy in Massachusetts was trying, and I think has lost in the legislature, similarly on a sort of a pragmatic take there. And there needs to be upside for people who do the right thing and take accurate positions here. Because, it's just the nature of the political process. Like, nobody ever gets everything they want out of anybody. And, like, that's fine. But just to sort of normalize this, right? That we should not be seeing this kind of like twilight struggle against the American oil and gas industry from Democrats, and people who are willing to accept that, like, need to get some warm fuzzies from the industry.
Yeah. No, that's good. You said something earlier, and Kevin's going to get mad at me because he worked hard to develop all these questions I'm supposed to ask, and I'm not asking them. But you said something earlier. I wanted to get your perspective on this. So this is personal opinion. I feel like, whether it's jet fuel or there's some technologies that are just going to take a long time to replace. Fuel for planes, maybe power generation. Nuclear may come faster than I think it will, but until it does, natural gas plays a role. So if that's the case, and we do reach a 2 degree C, what role do Democrats think resiliency and adaptation plays in, hey, we're not all going to drive electric vehicles in the next 10 years. So there's going to be some warming potentially. Do we need to build bigger seawalls on the coast of Florida? I guess what's the perspective of Democratic lawmakers, Democratic policymakers in that regard?
I think there's a good deal of support for sort of resiliency and preparedness kind of things here. I think Republicans, I'll be interested to see what happens in Florida, right? Because Florida is obviously a state that is quite exposed to warming. It's both very hot and also quite low-lying, very coastal. 25 years ago, I think Democrats really thought, for those reasons, that Florida voters were going to be champions for them on environmental issues. Florida also has traditionally opposed offshore drilling for its own economic reasons, does not have significant onshore fossil fuel development. The politics have not broken that way at all. This is a red state now. And I just don't know, can Republicans bring themselves to just acknowledge that this change is occurring and that it has real downsides that need to be addressed in some kind of way? Because I know that, in the Northeast, I was up in Maine over the summer, and the town I've got a house in has a climate resilience plan. And it's a little comical. It's fine. Like, the sea level is going to be higher, but, there's not that many people there. Florida, like Miami, has a really serious issue that requires significant thought and planning, particularly because they can't single-handedly do anything to alter the nature of the global energy system. So which is to say, like, I think it's more a question for Republicans really than for Democrats. But in principle, we should be coming together around this, that, we need to be prepared, especially where we have major coastal population centers.
We talk a lot about the trade-offs in energy. You've probably heard this before. I know our regular listeners sure have. We talk about the trade-offs between affordability, reliability, and sustainability. Basically, how clean is the energy, emissions, that sort of stuff. couple episodes ago, we had on Neil Brown from
Mhm.
the Progressive Policy Institute, and
Mhm.
PPI did a study where they looked at economic justice and energy justice and found that poor families, Black and brown families, communities had a higher energy burden,
Mhm.
primarily because of policy-driven infrastructure bottlenecks. Basically, you can't get natural gas into certain places,
Mhm.
certain cities, and certain neighborhoods. And even you'll have wealthier neighborhoods that are adjacent to it, wealthier zip codes, wealthier counties that are adjacent to it, that have access to this kind of infrastructure, and they have lower energy costs than these families. So where I'm going with this is,
Mhm.
so we end up with these price increases in New York, New England.
Mhm.
New England, they're literally importing LNG from Trinidad and Tobago
Yep.
when they could import pipeline natural gas from, say, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, right? In New England, the project you were writing about has already been approved. What would be your message when you talk to like the populist and abundance
Mhm.
factions of the Democratic Party about how to think about these trade-offs, the affordability, reliability, sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is trade-offs are real, but we always want to come up with ideas that ease the trade-offs, right? To the extent that we can. But also just, what you were talking about in terms of, impact on low-income African-American communities in New England. It's interesting. So I made a chart similar was showing utility costs as a share of household budgets. And it's quite a bit higher for African-American families than for white ones. I don't know, whatever. But I made that chart. I shared it with some friends of mine. One of them took that chart to a small family foundation that she's involved with, and she showed it to the people there, and they had not known that. And they were impressed by this piece of factual information and agreed with her recommendation that they stop funding a sort of anti-pipeline campaign on that basis. And so one thing that I think happens is that once the oil and gas industry becomes so conservative, it's full of Republicans who think that kind of argument that I just made is probably a little stupid, right? Like it's a very that's like a lib argument. But if you want to persuade liberals, you got to think like liberals, right? And this is information that is true that has been a little bit occluded from view, right? So, I think about there's different organizations in DC, like Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and they churn out distributional analysis of all kinds of stuff, right? You want to cut this, you want to change that tax, blah, 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 blah. They don't have any analysis of what is the distributional impact of a renewable portfolio standard rule, right? Maybe somebody could talk them into doing that. Walmart funds a lot of their food stamp research, right? Because this is a for-profit company, but they sell groceries to poor people, So they try to help progressive groups make the case that we should subsidize food stamps for poor people. So I think there's ways that we can engage to get people more educated about what is the trade-off exactly. Because, a lot of people have heard the talking point that solar is the cheapest source of electricity. And I don't need to tell you guys what the limitations of that analysis are. But if that's something that you've heard and that makes it easier for you to go along and get along, you're going to think, there isn't really a trade-off here. And there was this really good new report from the Livermore National Labs about that. In a lot of conservative states where they have plentiful renewable resources, they have added a lot of renewables in a really cost-lowering way. What happens in progressive states is that they have adopted policies that require renewable use in ways that go way past the cost effectiveness curve. And in New Jersey in particular, it's incredibly costly because it's the most densely populated state in the country. There's no place to put utility scale wind farm in the state of New Jersey. So when you require that they buy resources that in effect can't be constructed, you're creating very large cost explosion problems. And, you need an engineering solution to something like that. And when I wrote that, and I had people yelling at me, and they're like, well, we could build transcontinental transmission lines. I'm like, sure, you could, but are you? What are you doing to accomplish that? These are challenging engineering problems. And one of the main virtues, of oil and gas infrastructure is that it's well understood from a design and engineering standpoint. Like, you can't always just get permission to go do things, but it works if you want to order it up. A lot of this other stuff, I mean, I hope it pays off. Smart grids and utility scale batteries and small modular nuclear reactors. Like, this is all good. Like, we try to live in a creative, dynamic society. But it's good. A lot of it's pretty hypothetical at this point. And somebody has to, provably do it, not just say in a PDF, you could do it.
So before Bryan asks his next question, I just have to say, you've made my co-hosts very happy. They're both engineers.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, talking nerdy about engineering solutions usually doesn't go over well with large populations of people. But that's
doing what we can,
Yeah,
that's right.
So yeah, you, Matt, you'd spoken on kind of your article about a fundamentally bad analytical framework on some environmental policies, and just when looking at certain projects that are happening. So speaking of kind of engineering projects, what would a good analytical framework look like? From environmental policy groups, Democrats, and then honestly, what would that look like from help on the Republican side in oil and gas when it's related to our industry, and how to marry those and look at projects in a good way?
I think it is, you really want to go back to forward-looking cost-benefit analysis, right? So the question is, you'd like something like LNG export pause, came out under Biden, right? And you want to ask yourself, okay, if we do this, how does this impact the world economy, right? It's a hard question to answer, but you can know around the edges, right? At the margin, this is going to lower the global price of natural gas. It's probably going to raise the domestic price of gas somewhat. It's going to create a lot of GDP because you're going to extract more domestically, you're going to have more production, more jobs, things like that. Emissions impact depends on what you think the relevant margin is, right? I mean, how much of that gas is displacing renewables, how much of that gas is displacing coal, and you pencil it out, right? And I think, you also how much of it is displacing foreign natural gas. And I think if you go through that, you will see that whatever emissions impact increasing LNG exports have is going to be small. The direction is going to be ambiguous. And the main impact is going to be more money for Americans and less for people in Russia. That's the sort of the dominant sort of factor there. And so, you should give it the thumbs up, which is ultimately where it would have come down in a second Biden or Harris administration. But the framework that they're using instead is this framework that says, well, if we were to get to global net zero by 2050, what would fossil fuel usage curve have to look like? And it would have to be this incredibly steep decline drawdown. And that would mean that you couldn't build this infrastructure, which, has high capital costs and only pays off over time. And so saying, well, we shouldn't do it. But that's just not going to happen, right? It doesn't make sense to say, let's start with an unrealistic assumption and then reason backwards from the unrealistic assumption. You have to look at the actual things that are on the table and try to assess, what is the real impact that we're having here on a global system, right? Because the other problem is that they've gotten a lot of states to adopt state-level targets. And so, from a state-level perspective, if I say, okay, don't build the data center in Maryland, well, sure, that's going to reduce Maryland's emissions, but that has no impact at all on global emissions. It's completely meaningless. And, I learned about this at first because I'm a big housing guy. And so, of course, if you don't allow any housing to be constructed, that has a lot of quote unquote benefits for your state level emission target hitting, but it's completely pointless, right? So California just has very low per capita greenhouse gas emissions because the climate's very mild. It's just an ecologically good place for people to live. But there's no housing there. It's very expensive. They love outmigration of the population, which is really bad for the national economy, for the global environmental picture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just you have to try to look forward-looking basis, global perspective. And what you're going to see is that like the world is going to overshoot those targets, which you're allowed to feel however you feel about, but you need to make policy choices that have the actual desired impact rather than just that conform to, a hypothetical.
One interesting thing you mentioned, I was listening to a podcast a couple months ago, and they were mentioning how they were attributing some of the green movement in Europe to kind of opening up a lot of exports of energy from bad actors, Russia. So the kind of the geopolitical problems with if we're not giving out energy and having that kind of presence, that it can open it up to some other things. But one question I had to, if let's say pipeline project, any project, energy project is down the pipe, if oil and gas industry were to put pencil to paper and come out with an assessment report, things like that, how do you think that would be viewed by? Do you think it'd be viewed with a lot of skepticism from environmental groups, just on face value, or do you think there really could be some?
I would draw a distinction here, right? So there's an environmental movement that is really born, in the 1970s, and that has a set of values that are really just hostile to the idea of economic growth. The organizations that movement creates employ scientists who have made a lot of valid observations about specific things over the years. Like it turns out that some of the pesticides that the agricultural industry uses contain neurotoxins that are damaging to children. It is just true, right? That like when you burn fossil fuels, it puts different kinds of soot and other particulates in the air, and those have negative impacts on human health. The Democratic Party has become very responsive to those kinds of concerns. The question is like, can you as an industry help pull apart, like, what is the scientific public health concern about pollution from what is the ideological construct of environmentalism that like wants us all to, I don't know, like live in a shack that's powered by rooftop solar. And, if we can only take one shower a month, like that's just how we're going to live, right? Because that to me is like a crazy vision of society that most Democrats do not embrace. It's why when push comes to shove, right? Like when the price of gasoline is getting high, Joe Biden doesn't say, this is great. Now that gasoline is so expensive, we're getting closer to our climate goals, right? What does he do? It all depends, right? But it's like normal Democrats cheer when GDP goes up on their watch, right? When like there's jobs, when industries move to New York State, they say, this is great, right? So you need to educate those people about what the real costs and benefits of these things are. I think it's not credible when you come into a Democrat's office and you like are pretending that there is no such thing as air pollution, or that climate change is fake, or that this is all a plot by the Chinese government. But your strong argument that you have to make all the time is that in a large range of cases, the benefit, particularly of American production and distribution, far exceeds the costs of allowing these things to go forward. And it's, especially true. I mean, now that America is a big net exporter of energy, right? A lot of the politics of this were originally sort of shaped 15, 20 years ago around this idea that renewables were going to deliver energy independence to the United States of America because we were importing oil. And it was very bad for our terms of trade, other kinds of things like that. But now that the United States is a big exporter of these energy products, the national security arguments all kind of flip on their heads. The basic terms of trade dynamics are different. And, there's a course to sort of responsible stewardship of these natural resources that involves continuing to use them while saying Democrats are going to care more than Republicans about trying to develop technological alternatives. But until the alternative exists, like, you got to keep going with stuff that works and that fuels the modern economy.
This has been really good. Good conversation. Appreciate the time. I guess we've talked a lot about LNG and global impact. Just to kind of maybe dive in a little bit more on that, I had to look it up. I found out it was Tip O'Neill that said all politics is local. So thinking about that, how do, I guess, we as industry help policymakers message the value of kind of decreasing global emissions through LNG exports, because they're very much concerned about their district and state and making their constituents happy. Any thoughts on that?
I think the foreign policy and national security arguments are very strong there and very sort of important there. Finding people who, I also just talking to people who care about the national strategic landscape. I think Democrats have had their eye on the state of Texas forever, where I think it sounds like you come from, where my wife comes from, where I spend a lot of time.
Don't criticize me. I'm from Mississippi, the real South.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Texas claims to be the South, but I might get a bunch of arguments.
Well, there you go.
Kevin, you might have to edit this part out.
There's no universe in which the Democratic Party is going to be competitive in the state of Texas where they are not attuned to the economic benefits of oil and gas production. I think anyone who thinks about this for like 5 minutes is going to reach that conclusion, right? But this is a state that has what Democrats say they want to be standing for, right? A huge, rapidly growing Latino population, really big, rapidly growing metro areas. This is where the values the Democrats say that they care about, have to be able to play if you are going to make it work nationally. And you talk to anybody, whether it's my brother-in-law or like the lady who owns the taqueria in town or anything. It's like everybody knows people who are working somewhere along the supply chain of oil and gas. And the fact that, with LNG exports, we can harm some of our foreign adversaries, we can provide strategic advantage to Europe, we can create a path to economic development in the third world that, is clearly better net than a world where people have no access to energy and electricity. This is just like an argument that needs to be engaged with, I think, in a serious way, because really the facts are on your side about this kind of thing. And it's just important to be present and to be out there.
So 2 more questions for you just to wrap up here. So let's start with the one that our usual host, Adam Murray, asks, and that is, it's 2-3 years from now. We've invited you back onto the podcast to talk about these kinds of issues again. Mm-hmm. What's gone well that's making you happy in terms of energy policy, in terms of energy and climate? What's gone well that would make you feel happy, feel like we're going in the right direction?
Well, so we've had a few bites at the apple of the bipartisan permitting reform deal concept, and hopefully something like that comes through. I think that's realistic, but also optimistic.
Yeah. I have to say that the permitting reform, as somebody who's relatively new to the whole oil and gas industry, that it's like everybody agrees that it's something that needs to get done. And yet it's been sitting around I came to the industry in 2020, so it's been going for at least that long. Stuart's been in this industry a while, so I think it's probably been longer than that, I'm guessing.
Well, it's funny. So I don't know if this is good or bad. I don't want to insult anybody, but I graduated college in 2008, and that is the same year that Keystone put in their permit to get the cross-border. And so here we are. For my whole career, Keystone has been trying to get a permit, and Keystone XL, and they have it. And this is what's funny. I had a friend from Oklahoma. My wife went to Auburn, and so he was at Auburn with her. Anyway, he and I were chatting. He ended up going to law school, being an attorney. Anyway, I was talking to him one night, telling him I got a job working in the oil and gas industry. And he was like, that Keystone XL, they have to get the presidential signature because it crosses the border. Good luck with that. Little did I know that he was spot on.
Yeah, issues sometimes can take a while before things happen, but it's on the agenda, which is always better than not being on the agenda, which is, where a lot of people are with their priorities.
So, all right, final question. Your book, 1 Billion Americans, your newsletter, Slow Boring, which I highly recommend everybody follow, even if it's just the free version, follow it. because subscribe to
No,
it.
you need the paid version.
Okay, well, definitely get the paid version.
You know, I've got a family. You know,
Yeah,
Got to pay those utility bills. Those utility bills.
Yeah. Yeah. So you often tackle these kinds of like counterintuitive supply side and policy arguments. For our audience intrigued by the conversation, intrigued by some of the things you're saying, how does the kinds of things that you've talked about today connect with the bigger themes in your work, and where do they go to learn more?
You know, I mean, I think the biggest theme that I have is that I am a believer in America, and I am a believer in a positive sum universe. You know, I think that trade and immigration and diversity and integration can do tremendous things for this country and for this world. And I came to bump up against surprising levels of like environmental doomerism as my book was wending its way through the sort of, the publishing ladies, because I hadn't intended ever to write about energy or climate really, but I was saying like, we should welcome more people to this country. We should try to promote larger families. The government should do more to support parents and children. And I had all these people coming up to me. They're like, oh, but there's more people living here. Like, aren't our emissions going to go up? And at first I was like, sure. But I mean, if somebody moves here from Ecuador and gets a much better job and is having a higher standard of living, and like, that's why the emissions go, like, that's good on balance, right? That's way better than dying in Ecuador. And that just turned out to be more counterintuitive in certain circles than I realized it was. So I started learning more about the climate science, about the energy piece of this. But everything I write about, whether it's housing, whether it's immigration, whether it's transportation, whether it's energy, it's about trying to show people like, yes, there are conflicts, there are problems, there are bottlenecks in the universe, but these are mostly solvable issues, and trying to take, as saying, Stuart, a more of an engineering approach to these problems of our society that, when humans interact with each other, we tend to have mutual gain in these kinds of things, but we do have, tension points, cross pressures, and we need to ameliorate those things and find win-win solutions and, build a better world.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the conversation. We'd love to have you back on at some point.
Yeah, thank you so much.
In the near future. With that, we're going to wrap up this episode, and we'll be back soon with another episode of the Let's Clear the Air Energy Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Let's Clear the Air Energy Podcast. If you like what you have heard, subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app. You can email us with questions or comments to letscleartheairenergypodcast@gmail.com.